Just beautiful. So we got about 30 seconds and then it will be go time. Okay, I am going to start the webinar, everybody. Hello to everyone just joining. We're going to give it about 30 seconds or so, and then we are going to get started with our webinar today, our morning session, I should say. Give it another 10 seconds and then we'll get going. Okay, it looks like we are pretty populated right now. So I am going to get started with everything. I would first off like to welcome everybody. My name is Jenny Sitchell. I'm with the National Council on Independent Living. I am the operations director there, and I also coordinate logistics for these events. I wanted to first welcome everybody, as I said earlier, to our latest ISLEnet webinar series. And this is the biennial ISLEnet Institute on Independent Living. And so I'm really excited over the course of these next 3 days to bring everybody a bunch of amazing information and content. My pronouns are she, her. I am a white female with curly brown hair, wearing a light blue V-neck top right now. Today's presentation is brought to you by the ISLEnet Training and Technical Assistance Project for Sills and Silts. The ISLEnet is operated by ILRU in collaboration with Nickel, April, and the University of Montana, with support provided by the Administration for Community Living at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. So to go over a couple of housekeeping things before we get started, captions are available in Zoom. Click Show Subtitle in your Zoom menu bar to turn them on. You may have to go to the 3 ellipses that say More in order to find this option. They're also running at AI Media, and the URL is a little too long to read, but it's available. I'll share it in the chat with everybody as soon as I finish speaking this. So AI Media, if you do want to go to that page, will allow you to enlarge the font and change the color and contrast of the captioning. Additionally, we have ASL interpreters that are present today and will be for all of the Institute sessions. We are presenting in gallery view, so the interpreter should always be visible. And please let me know if you cannot see the interpreter so that I can help figure it out with you. You will need to be in side-by-side mode. As you can see, we are PowerPoint sharing today. If you're not in that mode, you can go to the menu bar that says you are viewing Jenny's screen. Click View Options and select Side-by-Side View. This will allow you to see the PowerPoint and the interpreters at the same time. If you are using dual screens, you may also want to click Optimize for dual screens. You can adjust the size of the PowerPoint and the interpreters using the slider feature in the middle of the screen. We don't recommend joining the sessions by mobile or tablet if you want to see the interpreters and the PowerPoint at the same time. But if you are joining by mobile or tablet, most of these devices allow you to swipe left to change your view. You do not need to be on Zoom video to access the Institute sessions, and we will read all slide content and all questions out loud so that it will be available to individuals calling in on the phone or who cannot see visual content. And I just want to make sure that we can see the captions. And please put in the chat if you are unable to see the captions. And if you are having trouble, make sure that you go to the 3 ellipses that say more, or click on the show subtitle tab. So I do want to mention to everybody that the public chat is turned off, but you will still be able to send messages to the hosts and panelists. We are asking that you reserve the chat for a request for technical support only. Please do not use the panelist chat to submit content questions for the presenters. With our first session here, there are a number of easy, accessible ways to submit content questions, and we will be answering them as we are able to, but at the end of the first part of today. If you are on Zoom, you can simply type your question into the Zoom Q&A tab. You're also welcome to email your question to me, your session host. My email is Jenny, Jenny, @ncil.org, and I'll also put it into the chat box. Finally, if you're on the telephone today, you may press *9 to indicate that you have a question. Towards the end of each session also, we'll show you a link for an evaluation that will be added to the chat box. The evaluation will be open as soon as we enter that into the chat box, and we will be extremely grateful if you take a few moments to complete the evaluation after each session for this institute. We hope that these accessibility and logistics tips have been helpful to you. Please let me know if there's anything that we can do to improve your experience at the ISLEnet Institute. So now it's time to begin our first presentation, How Consumer Control and Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, DEI, Advance Leadership of People with Disabilities. So I want to introduce our presenters today. I'm going to start off with our first presenter for this portion, Richard Petty. He is the project director at the ISLEnet National Training and Technical Assistance Center for Independent Living. He is an ILRU co-director and former SIL executive director with Mainstream. And then I would like to introduce Bonnie O'Day, Ph.D. She is the former director of the Boston Center for Independent Living, the Southwest Center for Independent Living in Minnesota, and the Independence Center in Hampton Roads, Virginia. Dr. Linda Grooms will be presenting. She is the president and CEO of Achieving My Purpose. As a DEI consultant, she has directed diversity efforts for major corporations, educational institutions, government entities, and nonprofit organizations. And our final presenter for this first hour will be Bill Henning. He is the executive director at the Boston Center for Independent Living. So now I'm going to hand it over to our first presenter, Richard Petty. And Richard, take it away.
Thank you, Jenny. And everyone, again, welcome to the very first, the inaugural ILRU, ISLEnet T&TA Center Biennial Institute on Independent Living. And for this first institute, we'll have another one in 2 years. For this first institute, we are highlighting how consumer control and diversity, equity, and inclusion advance leadership in centers for independent living. That will be the focus of the next 2.5 days. And on our opening session, we have 3 presenters who will highlight these issues for us. And in this session, we will learn how consumer control became important for centers for independent living and for individuals with disabilities and in developing leadership. How CILs can advance their practices to become more diverse, equitable, and inclusive, and describe how CILs can advance leadership through consumer control and DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Let's move to slide 7, please. We're highlighting the importance of consumer control in disability-led organizations, why consumer control and disability-led organizations were needed, why they came to be a thing. And one of the best examples that I can think of is an individual, Ed Roberts, who is a gentleman who was found to be infeasible for rehabilitation by the state agency in the state where he lived. Later, he became a member of a group called the Squaffy Quads at Berkeley and an activist, where this group made the campus of Berkeley much more accessible for people with disabilities who at the time lived in the infirmary at Berkeley. That even extended to pouring wheelchair ramps using their own concrete by the dark of night. And Ed Roberts later became the head of the Berkeley CIL. He was developing his leadership, and Ed Roberts became the director of the state agency that found him to be infeasible for rehabilitation. And Ed said that we needed organizations like Centers for Independent Living controlled by people with disabilities because others didn't believe that we could be leaders, and not only that we could be leaders, but that we couldn't have even decent lives. People had such deep prejudice about people with disabilities. And I would submit to you that some of that prejudice still exists, and certainly centers play a key role in helping people develop their leadership both within centers and outside and beyond centers. And let's go to slide 8. You have your first homework assignment, and that is to go to the 60 Minutes video where Ed Roberts is interviewed by Harry Reasoner, excuse me, I can't talk this morning. And Ed makes the points about how difficult it was for him to advance. And Ed, you'll find as you spend the 13 minutes, there's a link here in the slides and there's a link in the materials to advance to be an international leader and an international traveler. And it's clear what Ed accomplished. And Ed says it's important that he was able to be a role model and that we can all be role models in leadership. And that's very valuable. And now I'm very pleased to introduce our first presenter, Dr. Bonnie O'Day, who's the former director of several Centers for Independent Living and a researcher. And Dr. O'Day will begin our discussion of how consumer control began, why it was needed, and she'll describe a little bit about how she, as a leader, advanced leadership. She'll be followed by Dr. Grooms, who will help us to understand diversity, equity, and inclusion from her work with community organizations and helping them to become more diverse, equitable, and inclusive. And then finally, Bill Henning will conclude this presentation with examples of how centers advance leadership through consumer control and diversity, equity, and inclusion. Bonnie, it's it's a pleasure to have you here, and please proceed.
Thank you. I want to be sure that I can be seen and heard. Can somebody give me a verbal yes?
Yes.
Great. Thank you very much, Richard. I appreciate that nice introduction. I'm going to talk about the roots of independent living. I will contrast the medical model with the consumer control model and talk about how consumer control promotes leadership. Please move to the Foundations of Independent Living movement slide. Independent living is based on several movements from the 1960s. Now, I know that probably none of you had been already born in the 1960s, and maybe your parents weren't born yet in the 1960s. But I think it's very important to understand where our movement came from. So there are several movements from the 50s and 60s that are the foundation of the independent living movement. And the first one is deinstitutionalization. People in past generations with developmental disabilities, mental health issues, and even women who didn't subscribe to the cultural norms were stuck not under their control in horrible, overcrowded institutions like Willowbrook. And there were some very significant exposés that were done in the late 60s, and people, particularly parents of developmental disabilities people, were horrified at the conditions there. And so based on that public outcry, we began to close down the institutions and move to more of a community-based independent living. And so centers focus on promoting community-based independent living services. The second movement from the 1960s that I want to talk about is the self-help movement. The self-help movement includes movements like the Alcoholics Anonymous movement, women's empowerment groups, and sexual assault groups that people themselves who had experienced a particular event in life or had a particular disability or difficulty would band together to provide support for themselves. And so it was people talking about their own experiences and becoming empowered by hearing that they were not alone. So that, of course, is what our peer counseling services are based on. The third pillar of our movement is consumerism. Consumerism grew out of a movement headed by Ralph Nader, Nader's Raiders, they used to call it, which promoted knowledge about the goods and services that we received and the food we ate, and having some choice over those things. It led to car and food safety standards and other types of standards. Civil rights, of course, is what our movement is based on, and it's based on civil rights movements of the 40s, 50s, and 60s, which led to important passage of important civil rights legislation, such as the Civil Rights Act and Title IX. And finally, demedicalization. Under the medical model, which I'll talk about in a minute, medical staff are seen as the experts on disability. And the demedicalization movement was based on, a lot of it was the women's movement that said that medical staff are not always the experts. And I remember reading a book back then called Our Bodies Ourselves, which really explained a lot about sexuality and bodily functions. It was really ahead of its time, but it's based on the understanding that we are the experts on what we need. So all of these movements led to independent living principles, which I won't talk about in detail because I think you all know them: cross disability, peer support, advocacy and civil rights, community-based services, and consumer control. In the remainder of my presentation, I will contrast the medical model of disability with the independent living model, focusing on consumer control. Next slide, please. This slide shows some precepts of the medical model, which I will go through. The medical model assumes that the effects of the physical or mental impairment can always be ameliorated through professional intervention, either rehabilitation or medical intervention. Medical professionals are seen as the experts on all of disabilities and are the arbiters of most major decisions about what disabled people need. I'm sure many of you are familiar with filling out forms that require a doctor's certificate to use paratransit, to get Social Security benefits, to get medical benefits, et cetera, et cetera. The medical model views disability as solely a biological phenomenon, and that the impairment itself, not discrimination or the environment, is the cause of whatever problems the disabled person faces. The disability is central to the person's self-concept. I see myself under this model as a visually impaired person or a person with low vision, not as a female, not as a worker, not as a married person. You know, under this model, it's all about the visual problem I have, or the blindness. Having a disability under this model is synonymous with helplessness, dependence, and the need for help and social support. The other problem with the medical model is that it does not address the long-term needs of people with disabilities, because it doesn't recognize that we can disconnect from the medical system, come to accept our disability, and live a normal life without pursuing a cure. I can't remember when the last time was I went to the eye doctor. So the intervention under this model is primarily medical in nature. Not that medical staff don't have a role in our lives, they do. I happen to wear glasses, and when I need a new prescription, I go to the doctor and they measure my acuity, etc., and figure out what glasses will be the best for me. But in terms of how I live my life, what speech software I use, how I access my iPhone, what I use to cook in the kitchen, etc., how I do my job, those are things that the medical staff is not familiar with. And I've had to turn to blind people themselves to find out how to do those things. How many of us know people that have gone from one doctor to another seeking a cure? And how many of us have actually done that or had our parents do that for ourselves? And sometimes, unfortunately, you know, all of the surgeries that we've had exacerbate our disability instead of making it better. Learning from the civil rights movement of other minority groups, we began to understand that the problem is the inaccessibility of society. Whereas, and I think this is important, traditional rehab and medical programs focus on changing the person, the individual. We began to concentrate on changing society. There was a new definition of disability as a product of the interaction between the individual and the environment. For example, if a wheelchair user encounters a ramp, then they're not really thinking about their disability. They simply go up the ramp. If it's structured correctly, go in the building and go about their business. If the individual encounters a staircase, then the wheelchair versus the staircase becomes the problem. It's the interaction between the person's use of the wheelchair and the staircase. So independent living is the broad social and civil rights movement that sprang from all these perspectives, bringing together people of differing disabilities to advocate for social change. And that's the most important thing a center can do, is advocate for social change. We have redefined ourselves more like a minority group more in need of civil rights legislation, accessible environments, and workplace accommodations. Next slide, please. So, what is consumer control? At the individual level, consumer control means control over the services we receive. It means control over one's life choices. And most importantly, it means the freedom to try and succeed, take risks, and maybe even fail in some things and try again or try something different. One of the sayings that I really like that's come about in the last 20 years is nothing about us without us. When we speak for ourselves, we want to be involved in all of the decisions that affect our lives. At the organizational level, we form and participate in our own advocacy groups. They can be single disability or cross disability. Through these organizations, we determine what our advocacy agendas should be. Next slide, please. At the CIL level, it means that the majority of our board and staff have disabilities, and that the racial, gender, and disability mix of our constituency, the consumers that we serve, should be reflected on the board and staff. If a CIL constituency, for example, is 50% African or African American, we don't want an all-white staff or board. That just seems really obvious. It also means that consumers help to decide what's important, what kinds of services the CIL will provide, and what kind of advocacy the CIL will do. If consumers think that transportation is important, and Bill Henning doesn't see it that way, I'm picking on Bill, I know that the Boston Center will focus on transportation because that's what consumers want. It's very important that consumers have a voice in the services that are going to be provided and the advocacy that the centers will do. Also, consumers support each other through peer counseling and support groups and determine for themselves the services that they will provide. Some consumers may even become peer counselors or other staff. Next slide, please. This type of consumer control advances leadership. I'll make a few comments about this topic, and others then in this presentation will carry it further. Your most important role as a staff or board member is to promote people with disabilities into leadership positions. Think about it this way. You, as a director or staff, can't do it all. Though it sometimes seems like it'll take more time to help others take on different roles, it's worth it in the long run. For example, if someone is supposed to testify at a city council meeting, you could, maybe a budget hearing or something, you could do it in your sleep. You don't even have to write up your comments. You've given them so many times. But perhaps a person who's receiving services from the center could offer that testimony. You might have to meet with that person, go over their testimony, make sure it sounds good, make sure it addresses what needs to be addressed, and help them, give them a voice to speak to the city council. And, I've done that in the past, and it is so powerful to have people who have received services from the center be the spokesperson, either at a city council meeting or a legislative hearing. If you have an advisory committee or some kind of policy committee, maybe you shouldn't be the one to serve on it. Maybe one of your staff or consumers should serve on it. You might need to work with that person before the meeting to go over the agenda, make sure the meeting goes smoothly, help them figure out what's important and what they want to say at the meeting, but allow them to do it in their own voice, in their own way. You may also want to bring someone with you the first time you meet with a legislator That may be inconvenient. You may have to work with the person on what they're going to say, organize transportation, etc. But then they've forged a relationship with that legislator and can meet with them on their own the next time. Finally, and this is the most difficult piece, I think about who will replace you as you move in your own career. I actually had the opportunity to do that when I was in Norfolk, and there were 3 individuals at our center who were very strong leaders. 2 of them assumed directors at different centers. I like to think that I helped make that possible for them. And the 3rd person assumed the director's role when I left. I have seen CIL staff and directors get stuck in their positions long after their energy and enthusiasm has waned. In other words, you know, being a CIL staff or director, it's pretty overwhelming and it's easy to get burned out. So I think we all need to challenge ourselves to assume positions in the broader movement or the broader community, bringing our CIL philosophy to other organizations that serve people with disabilities or other constituencies in the community. That then enables someone else with a disability to take our place. After all, none of us want to work forever, and none of us will live forever either. So we need to start thinking about who the next generation of leadership will be. That concludes my presentation. Thank you very much.
Greetings and thank you, Bonnie, for that interesting presentation that certainly leads into what I will be discussing today. I first want to thank the organizers for inviting me to participate in this panel. As an outside consultant, what I bring to the table is best practices and my experience working with a number of organizations in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors. So what I am presenting today is first the key elements in order to align your practices to be more inclusive, and then secondly, what the processes look like. Next slide. As I start with the key elements for authentic DEI change, I want to first talk about terminology because one of the things that we're hearing right now is DEI, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the reality is that order really should be DIE, diversity, inclusion, and then equity. And I say that because you want to start with bringing diversity and representation in your organization. And then you want to look at your systems to make sure that they are inclusive. And then the equity part is taking the next step to reduce the barriers that make everyone be in an equitable situation. Now, DIE is probably not a good acronym. And so that's why you see a number of organizations calling it DEI. But I will also tell you, you will see JEDI, which is Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And you'll also see DEIA, which is Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Accessibility. I'm seeing now a number of organizations that are really calling out accessibility by making it part of their acronym and what they're doing. So part of it is having an understanding of the terminology. And then the key is to really know why you're pursuing this DEI journey. And I say it's important to know your why, because as you go through this journey, what you will find is there are going to be some resistance, there's going to be some challenges, and if you can focus back on the why and how it ties into your organization, it allows you to work through those challenges that you might face. Secondly, after you've identified your why, you want to have a very strong commitment and support of your board chair and CEO. Now, it's very interesting and it's it's a need to clarify what commitment and support is, because too often I find that the CEO and the board chair will indicate that the organization is committed to DEI, but their actions, they don't necessarily walk the talk. They're writing the letter to talk about it, but they allow the staff to do all the heavy lifting. And what I would suggest that if it is a committed and supportive board chair and CEO, they're setting the tone, they're walking the talk, which means that if they have hiring opportunities either on the board or the CEO and leadership staff, that they are considering a diverse group of individuals for candidates for the board or candidates for leadership. And if there's training going on in the organization, they are actively participating in the training. So they're not just saying, you all do that, but they're actually being a part of it as well. Thirdly, it's important to understand that this is a long-term commitment. There is no quick fix. This is really a cultural change, and the culture that exists in your organization today did not happen overnight. So if you're needing to adjust your culture to be more inclusive, it's going to take some time. So it's important to know that this is transformative and not transactional. And I see too many organizations looking at this as, okay, for this next year, we're going to get this done, and then we're going to be done with it. Well, it really doesn't work that way. And many organizations will be addressing this process, if they do it right, for many, many years, probably up to 10 years as they get it really incorporated in their culture. Another point in the key element is that it does require time, energy, and money. And unfortunately, what I find oftentimes is individuals will have the DEI efforts as part of their responsibility, but they're not accountable for that. They're not really, their job performance does not count that. So they're doing it as extra. And that should not be the case. If it is part of their accountability that you want everyone to be involved in it, then they should be getting credit for that as a performance, and it's not just an add-on. It's going to possibly require money only because of recruitment efforts. If you're identifying a diverse component that you haven't had in the past, you may have to spend some money to recruit that effort. If you're needing to adjust your systems in order to be more inclusive, that's going to cost money as well. The next point is, do expect discomfort and some resistance. I don't think this is a surprise, but it does come up that everybody's not going to be on the same page. Many people may think that they're losing something in the process, and so they don't want to see this going. I hear oftentimes organizations say that we're doing just fine, so why do we need to pursue this? Well, because of the fact that you're going back to your why, and the why might be that we want to embrace a diverse environment. The why might be that we want to broaden our donor opportunities. The why may be that we want to enhance our mission and values. Those are the things we have to be reminded of when the discomfort comes in. The next point is, if it's anything worth doing, it's worth measuring. So it's important that you set measurable criteria so that you will know in the process how well you're doing. So that could be measurements for individuals through their performance review. It could be measurement around your demographics. It could be measurement around some of your financial investments, and I'll talk about that a little later, but you'll be looking at various things that will evaluate whether you're making progress. And lastly, which is most important, is you really should determine your organization's readiness to take on a significant DEI initiative. If you're caught up in a capital campaign, if you're having challenges with a crisis of somewhat, if you have an organizational instability, if you have a leadership change or other competing initiatives, that may not be the time to have an aggressive inclusive journey or DEI journey. It doesn't say that you can't do some things going in, but if you want to be intentional, you want to make sure that there are not other conflicting and competing issues that are going to get in the way of you moving forward. Next slide. So after we talk about the key elements, and if you're ready to pursue, then I would offer these 4 points as a way to address the issue. And if this was a graphic, it would really be in a circle as opposed to the bullet points, because it is a continual effort, and that it's not linear, and it's not step 1 and step 4 and you're done. But the first thing that you want to do is to assess your current state to find out just where you are today. And that might mean looking at your mission and values and asking yourself, do your core values support equity? And sometimes organizations have a separate value on equity as part of their values to make sure that it's important to the mission of the organization. You want to also look at your current programs and the clients or consumers that you serve today, and ask yourself, as even Bonnie mentioned, is the representation of your consumers a representation of the individuals in your community? And if not, are there some areas that you want to explore to bring in a diverse group of consumers? And then, is the programming appropriate for the consumers that you have? As you're assessing your current state, you want to look at your governance, your board, and what that looks like. Is it diverse? Is it representing what you want to do from a mission standpoint? And I'll talk about that a little later. Also, you want to look at your internal policies and practices. How are we in our HR practices in not only recruitment, but succession planning, training, all of those various aspects? Even in the performance review, are we asking individuals to embrace DE&I? And then lastly, as you're looking at your current state, you want to see how you're doing your fundraising, and if there's a opportunity to diversify who your donors might be. So again, the first step is really trying to assess where you are. And then the next step is really trying to identify where do you want to be in a future state. And that future state may be an interim future state, and you're going to change that as you improve and do things further. But you ask yourself, what would be your future state? And once you determine that, then you identify what initiatives need to be developed and how they can be aligned with your strategic plan. Because DE&I is not just one more effort, it's not one more program, it's a part of the business of the organization, or it certainly should be. So instead of having a strategic plan and then also having a DEI plan, you want to embed the two together. So once you have thought about what the initiatives are that you're already doing and how DE&I can address that, then the next step is really the execution and the implementation. And what kind of things are you going to do first? Now, education and training is possibly a part of this, because you want everyone in your organization to understand terminology, to understand where we're going, to even allow them to be able to improve from an individual or personal standpoint. But I will say to you, training may be necessary, but it's not the end all. And too many organizations start their efforts with training and believe that that's all that's necessary, and that's not the case. Also, in your implementation plan, a communication strategy is extremely important. You want to keep the organization abreast to what's going on. You want that to happen at all levels. You want to be inclusive in your newsletters, in your websites, in the photos that you may have on your website or on the walls of your organization, so that there's a message that you are an inclusive environment. And those are just a few of the ideas as it relates to implementation. If I go further into implementation on programming, you want to, as I think Bonnie also mentioned, you bring the stakeholders to the table. Too often, the leadership or the staff of an organization is making decisions about clients or consumers, and they don't necessarily have a clue as to what those needs are. So it's important to encourage and bring those individuals to the table so that they, through their lived experiences, can tell you what is needed. You also want, as I mentioned before, you want to evaluate if the consumers that you have are diverse, or if to succeed in your mission, it's important that you bring in others. Is someone representative of the LGBTQ area part of the mix that you have? Do you have racial diversity? Do you have socioeconomic diversity? And are any of these factors important to what you're doing long term? From a marketing standpoint, what do your documents look like? Are they in other languages? Are you utilizing diverse media? How are you sending the message about what you're trying to do from an inclusive standpoint? I mentioned governance. That's another area that you might want to consider. What is your board composition? And another piece is, what are your board requirements? I've talked to too many organizations that have a give and get policy that may be really exclusive to just one level of individuals who might be more wealthy than others. And so there may be other ways that you might look at those board requirements. And then also your source of candidates. Are you identifying the same people because the same board members are looking at their center of influence and not looking outside? So you may want to source out different ways of recruiting candidates for your board. I mentioned earlier, but when you talk about leadership and management, that they are to set the tone, but they also should be mentoring and coaching all of their staff, as opposed to just those that they're comfortable with. They should be thinking about succession planning and to make sure that those diverse candidates have the opportunity to grow in the organization. And you should also hold your team accountable. This is not just a leadership responsibility, but everyone has an accountability. So what is your team members doing to engage in conversations and working effectively with your diverse staff? And then lastly, in implementation, I would just suggest that your systems may be evaluated, whether it's procurement to find out if you are including diverse suppliers, if you are having investment of funds, are your investment houses diverse? Are you even having maybe a diverse organization to be one of your investment sources? And then the HR practices, what are you doing from a recruitment standpoint? But even more important, what are you doing to retain the people in your organization? So given all of that, and again, this is taking time and you can't do it all at the same time. The last part would be, let's evaluate our progress. That could start with surveys from your employees or your clients or consumers to find out how well you're doing. You could be looking at demographics. You can be looking at various aspects. And once you assess yourself, then you start the process all over again and assess what your new normal is from a current state. Thank you.
Hello, I'm getting on. Hi, thank you, Dr. Grooms and Bonnie. You both made outstanding presentations and to some extent said a lot of what I was thinking of saying, but I will introduce myself a little bit more. I'm Bill Henning. I direct Boston Center for Independent Living. Previously, I was with the Cape Organization for Rights of the Disabled in Hyannis, Massachusetts. And I've been in disability rights now for 38.5 years. And I came into the field as a community organizer. And being a community organizer, what that does is focus me on individual empowerment and community empowerment, which in a lot of ways is the core of consumer control, as Bonnie indicated in her presentation. I'll also note, and Richard had said this when we were preparing for this, he said, hey, Bill, you know, you're an able-bodied center director, and that's true. And I'm a white male able-bodied center director, which is kind of unusual. And how have I survived in this role in somewhat of a leadership position for 38 years and counting? I think I'm in good standing with the board here and the staff. And it's because I believe in consumer control. I believe in diversity. I believe in empowering other people, and it's helped to make our work, our advocacy campaigns, our individual services stronger because it's owned by the people who receive the services. It's owned by the people who are advocating for change, whether it be transportation, housing, healthcare, you name it. I couldn't have survived if I did not empower people, the core of consumer control. One thing I think that's really important as we look at consumer control is we consider what is the disability community. I think we've been in an age in recent years where, you know, DEI has landed. It's a wonderful thing. We've practiced it here, I'd like to believe, since I've been at BCIL for 20 years and previously when I was at CORD in Hyannis. But clearly we've accelerated, put our foot on the pedal on this in many areas. And it's also, we're seeing this national pushback on DEI, critical race theory, things like that, because we're making people feel uncomfortable, as they should be. And as I look at it in disability, I think, you know, the elephant in the room, though people call it out from time to time, is we've historically been a movement of white people. And you can argue or dissect why that is, but I think it's incumbent upon us when we talk about consumer control that we think in terms of a broad community, the whole community. And that's why I think DEI is so important. Disability rights rooted in white communities. That's not to say there aren't fantastic BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color leaders in our movement. There are some in BCIL whom I look up to, Cortland Towns, Diana Hu, but as a movement, that's something for us to think of. It's a marching order and I kind of embrace it. And as we look at this, just, you know, to maybe riff a little bit on what Bonnie and Dr. Grooms have said, I want to talk about a little bit about what I think consumer control and leadership is. If we could go to the next slide, please. And Bonnie said this, you know, it's not having every staff and public facing message come from the director, even if you could nail it. It's consciously delegating responsibility and letting those representative of an issue take the lead. We probably have about 7 advocacy campaigns going right now, and there's a consumer leader for each one. It's not to minimize staff's role. Staff are involved in this, you know, 50 hours a week in some cases or more. You become experts, but your obligation is to delegate, to bring up, pull up into leadership positions. It makes us all stronger. You know, the more spokespersons, the better. And again, it's not to absolve anyone of their important roles, but it's to think and include in our roles, expanding the populace who are involved in the issues. And if we could go to the next slide, please. You know, and when I think of consumer control and DEI, Dr. Grooms listed a whole lot of what it takes to run a DEI effort. And, you know, a couple things really cemented in my mind. She said it will take 10 years. That's real important to know. 10 years. It may take longer. I would argue it's just got to become part of who you are. It's got to become part of the DNA of an organization. And there were lots of steps she mentioned, and I've seen many nonprofits. I'm not just talking about independent living centers do things, but it's not any single one thing. It's not just an outreach table in an underserved community, or just having a DEI officer, or noting MLK Day or the ADA anniversary, or even celebrating Pride Month, or adding that you're an affirmative employer to your job ads, or issuing statements. It's all of those things, but it's really incorporating it, and it's a very concerted process. As Dr. Groom said, it has to be owned by leadership, and then it has to be owned by everybody. And it's daunting. We can look in the mirror and go, we haven't done a good job at this, perhaps, or we've been mediocre, or we've done well, but we want to get better. And what do? After George Floyd was murdered in 2020, we went deeply introspective at BCIL. Why did we go introspective? Because Black Lives Matter was out in the streets calling out police violence against people of color. And we live in a major urban area in the state of Massachusetts. And that stuff goes down here too. And where did we sit? Where did we fit? And we realized even then, despite efforts of being diverse, of being committed to it, we really weren't even embracing anti-racism as a concept. That an understanding that racism has permeated our society for over 400 years, since 1619. And that what could we do to understand the institutional power structure that embraces exclusion in some ways? If you go back to Ed Roberts and what Bonnie was talking about, trying to change the University of California at Berkeley and then the entire rehab system of California, that was changing an institutional structure, a medical model that viewed people with disabilities as less than whole, as less than. And we looked at ourselves at BCIL as, deficient even in DEI, because we were going through steps. We were doing a lot of the things Dr. Groom spoke about, but I don't think we had the real baseline understanding. So we started to produce stories from people of their experiences with racism, staff with disabilities who had experienced racism. And the racism touched upon things other than disability as well, but it was to be inclusive of the experience of the broader community. And out of that, we formed an anti-racism committee. And the committee is comprised of staff. Its leadership is staff. Right now, it's 80% BIPOC members of the community. And this is part of their job. One's a senior manager, one runs our youth department, one's an outreach person, the other's a community organizer, but this is in their job description too. This is what they do for BCIL, this is what they do for disability rights. We've tried to understand that we can't do disability rights, we can't provide independent living services unless we are attuned to the broader community. It's not simple work at all. Some of the things this committee has done is, I mentioned we've issued profiles of people. We've done trainings with staff. They've actually done trainings with the State Rehab Council now. We're affiliating to look at ADA compliance from an anti-racism perspective with another organization in the city. And we've also had dialogues. We had dialogues on white supremacy. We've stepped up our outreach. We opened up a satellite office in probably the most diverse neighborhood in the city of Boston, Fields Corner, which is an intersection for many different communities, Old Line white residents, Vietnamese community, Latino, African-American, African, and it's very exciting. And we see this as just tremendous enrichment to our experience, to the work we're doing, to what needs to be done. And it's lots of things. And again, having been in this for all these years, it would be daunting. So let's say you do it, your self-audit. You're listening to this and go, we do some of this, we don't do some of it. Gosh, it's so much to do. it might be starting with an outreach table. I said it's not just an outreach table, but maybe that's a start, or maybe it's appointing somebody with a DEI officer. You know, download the slides, look at what Dr. Grooms presented, because it's there for you to do, and it's going to take time. It's really going to take time. But I would say it does have to become part of who we are. It is part of that civil rights legacy. And it also, of course, includes people from the LGBT community. Gender identity is huge. We've had a number of we've had a couple presentations by non-binary folks. We have a number of non-binary staff, and we want to respect where they are too in all of this. It's a very emerging world of people feeling comfortable in themselves, yet there's also this tremendous pushback where you all are very aware of it. It does make people feel uncomfortable. If we could go to the next slide, that would be useful. So here's a little bit of what I talk about with the anti-racism committee. So it includes BIPOC people. That's the leaders, because it's talk about anti-racism, but make no mistakes, this isn't just for BIPOC people, this is for everybody, because it is a community. Independent living centers by definition are community. And again, just to build upon some of the points already made, but I think they're worth re-emphasizing, repeating. You know, give prominence to your consumers in media appearances and interactions with elected officials at public hearings as possible. People know the issues, and don't worry if they mess it up. It's okay. They may not be the most articulate people, but that's okay. They are the message in a lot of ways. The person with a disability speaking out is the message in a lot of ways. I've done work on and off for 30 years with ADAPT. And one of the things adapted when it was first started in the early 1980s with its direct action confrontation, it was confronting an issue, but it was shattering the stereotype of people with disabilities as passive, as having to be cured because of the medical model, of the old patronizing image from like the telethons, things like that. It was doing two things. It was shattering a public perception, and it was pursuing issues such as lifts on buses or seeking attendant programs. And I think that's what we're doing. We definitely want to put faces, voices, writings of our staff, of our consumers out there. And we want to think broadly on what our community is. Yes, we're mandated to have a majority board, leadership, and staff being people with disabilities, but we want that to be as inclusive of the broader community that's out there. And what Bonnie presented, what Linda presented, it was just dynamite. I think they are great Rosetta Stones, guides for where any organization can go. I will download them and look at them and use them here, because it's constant assessment, looking in the mirror. And anyone in a leadership position, the more power you give, I think the more you get, because it really strengthens the group. So thanks for a chance to speak, and maybe we have time for some questions, Richard, or comments, whatever, or further comments from Dr. Grooms or Dr. O'Day, my good friend formerly when she was at BCIL.
And we do have time. And as we're concluding and waiting to see if we do have some questions or comments, this is an important time for me to remind you that we have an evaluation of this session for you to complete. We take evaluation very seriously. We use it. It's important to us to know what you think. We use it to improve our future trainings, and we very much appreciate you to take a few moments to complete the evaluation and submit it to us. We'll be very grateful. Thank you. And Jenny, if there are questions or comments, we have a moment or two to take those.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Dr. Grooms, and thank you, Dr. O'Day. So we have a couple questions coming in, and I will kind of direct these as needed. But our first question, and Richard, I'm just going to have you turn off your camera, if that works. Perfect. Thank you. Our first question is, I'm going to direct this one at Dr. Grooms. We have Kay that wrote, I like Dr. Groom's comment on transformative versus transactional. Can you expand on this further?
Sure. Thank you for the question. When I think about transactional, it's really trying to work within the current status quo and just tweaking things, doing a few tasks, but not changing anything in any significant manner. Transformative says that maybe you change the status quo. You might want to restructure the system in some way. Rather than just tweaking the system, it may be a total restructure. It's about changing maybe the way of our being. That's very different than perhaps what it has been. So that's the difference between transactional and transformative. I hope that helps.
Thank you. So our next question, I'm gonna sort of let you guys dictate on this one who wants to answer. But a question from Sonam is, can more be done to encourage leadership for older and for younger workers? Sometimes ageism on both ends keeps those of us that want or are ready for leadership stuck in place. Does anybody have any comments on that? And feel free to unmute yourself and turn on your camera if you do have a comment.
Well, this is Richard. Oh, go ahead, Bill, please.
I guess my camera's not coming on. I think it gets back to instituting the transformative change, that you have to have an organization that's open to seeing leadership, understanding that it doesn't always, leadership can come in many forms. There's certainly a library full of booklets on leadership. There are ILRU documents on leadership, I'm pretty sure, but I think it's the attitude and looking at what you need and understanding, who's going to promote somebody. It's usually a director. So I'm kind of talking to a peer, and believe me, I try and get insights from my peers in Massachusetts all the time. This is not a solo operation, and I consult with our senior management team about 5 times a day to make it a team effort. It's really taking that on as a mission of independent living centers. I think Bonnie said that, she talked about 3 of the people she was overseeing running centers. Kudos, obviously, Bonnie has always had a fertile mind and had this consumer control and advancement. I think it's just being true to it, in my opinion. I don't know, Richard?
If I could just add very quickly, walk the walk. It means hiring younger leaders, hiring older leaders, who people experience when they come into your center is who they will learn from, who will be their role models, who will support them. And if they find younger people there and they're a younger person, if they're an older person and they find older people there, and the same for diversity and equity and inclusion, it makes all the difference as to who we find in centers when we arrive there.
That's a great point. And thank you, Bill, for those comments. I was really happy when you took over at BCIL because I knew it would be continue to be a strong center. And I will say to Dr. Grooms that that's about the best presentation on DEI I've ever heard. And I've heard quite a few, so thank you. I would say the best way to recruit young people into your center and older people as well is to start programs that are oriented toward them. A transition program from school to work or school to independent living for students and for older people, you know, some type of maybe support groups on dealing with an acquired disability might help. That puts you in touch with the communities that you're trying to serve and then promote into leadership positions.
Great, thank you. Thank you to our first session presenters. We do have our next session coming up directly after this for an hour, and then we get a big break, and then we come back again later this afternoon. So I just want to thank Bonnie, Richard, Bill, and Linda for presenting right now and presenting for this past hour. And I want to get our next presenters up and going. So I am going to kind of transition this into our next hour of presentation, or about 50 minutes at this point. So I just started sharing a new screen. And before I get into this, just make sure that you fill out the evaluation for this first session, because we are moving on to our next session now. Make sure that you fill out that evaluation. We will repost it in the chat because we want all the feedback we can right now on this. So I will have Sharon repost that in the chat. And then I'll move on to our next presenters. So for our next presentation, we have Consumer Control, our foundation for the past and future. Our presenters for this session, before I get into the presenters, same sort of housekeeping tip as before. Cart captioning and ASL interpreters are available. Q&A, we're going to run it sort of the same way that we just did. You can use the Zoom Q&A tab, or you can press *9 into your phone. You can submit questions at any time, and we'll wait until the Q&A break to address them. And we're going to have a separate link for the evaluation for this session. And we'll ask you to fill that out after this session, but then also after the second part of this session this afternoon. So to go into the presenters, unfortunately, Judy Human was unable to make it today. So I'm going to kind of move on to Daryl Jones. Daryl is the interim executive director at the National Council on Independent Living. She's a former ISLNet project director. And co-founder and first director of the Rochester Center for Independent Living, one of the first Title VII funded CILs. We have Luann Kibbe, who is Systems Advocacy Manager at Southeast Kansas Independent Living Resource Center. She's an activist in Western Kansas Association on Concerns of the Disabled, which gave rise to the founding of Link, Inc., one of the first Title VII funded centers as well. And then we also have Paula McElwee here. She is the Director of Technical Assistance at the ISLNet Training and Technical Assistance Center for Independent Living at ILRU. She's also the co-founder and first director of Link, which I mentioned before with Luann, is one of the first Title VII funded CILs. So now I'm going to hand it over to Paula, Daryl, and Luann, and let them take it away. Whoever is going to speak first, I'm going to have you, and I'm going to spotlight you, Paula, so that everyone can see you. Okay, thank you all.
Oh, yay.
Here's our next session.
Good morning, everyone, and or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Welcome to this session. We're going to talk a little about the grassroots consumer groups that led to the creation of local centers, partly, and then some national consumer-controlled centers or groups that also came out of that. So we're going to give you our own experience and reference the experience of some of the others as a part of that. We're going to talk a little about how that can guide us to look at consumer control in independent living spaces, because we saw then and we see now various levels of implementation of true consumer control. So we will talk a little bit about that and how that impacts communities and what we can do to make sure that that foundation of consumer control applies today to current situations. So that importance of consumer control as a priority for centers is the key focus of what we want to talk about. Let's look at the next slide. It's slide 7. Thanks. So consumer control, to start with, is not about compliance. And I want to make this extremely clear, because it is in the regulations. It shows up in the Rehabilitation Act. It is required. And so centers must have 51% of their staff, 51% of their board, and 51% of their leadership, which if you only have one leader, an executive director, that executive director would be a person with a disability. So there's this requirement in law. And so we must do those things in order to be compliant, but it isn't about compliance. And because I work with centers who are out of compliance and help them to come into compliance, I've had a couple of disturbing conversations with boards. For example, I remember sitting with a board of directors and saying to that board of directors, you must have 51% of your board be people with disabilities. And one of the board members said, just started pointing at the members who had said they didn't have a disability and said, well, you wear glasses, so you have a disability. And I know that, and he started talking about things that were, you know, conditions that these folks had that he felt like would qualify them to be a person with a disability so that they could meet this compliance requirement of 51% for the board. The problem with that was, and continues to be sometimes, that people who do not identify for themselves that they're a person with a disability miss the spirit of what was intended in the law. Because what's intended in the law is that people with disabilities who want to help control this center, who want to help drive the future, who want to actually make changes in their community, those are the folks that I consider to be the people with a disability. So they have a disability, but they also have a heart for consumer control, community access, equal access in the community. And that's much more than compliance. You know, was another situation, and this center had been cited for non-compliance by a state review. And they had a very small staff. They had 3 on their staff and a very small board. There were 4 on the board. And they wanted me to come out and do some training to help them to accomplish their plan of correction. And I got there and they said, oh, good news, we've hired a new executive director. And I said, oh, you have? So I turned to the new executive director and asked a question, which, by the way, is always legal to ask of people after they've been hired and before in most situations for affirmative action purposes. But I turned to him and I said, I said, what is your disability? What is your disability? Do you have a disability? And he said, no, I don't have a disability. And I said, well, then you're out of compliance with this issue of consumer control. And you have to have 51% of the leadership be people with disabilities. And he said, well, both my staff have disabilities. And I said, yes, and that meets that requirement that you're the leader, and the leader also has to have a disability. And its response was, well, my wife has a disability. That counts, doesn't it? My answer was no, the person who is in leadership must be the person who has 51% of leadership must have disabilities. Charlie Carr made an excellent comment in the last session about this issue of, is it okay for there to be a non-disabled executive director of a center? And, you know, you have to look, don't you, at this whole issue of where things are related to the heart of consumer control. And this center was missing the point, left and right, right? And what they ended up saying is, okay, well, we'll just make all three of our staff leadership. We'll give them different titles, and then we will be in compliance. Well, they missed the point that the voice of their center, the leader of their organization, was someone without a disability who was only going to speak on behalf of his wife when he's out in the community. Do you see the problem? So I have a lot of concerns about how sometimes consumer control is for compliance when it really ought to be for activism. It came out of activism. So we're going to talk about a few examples of that. Luann's going to lead off with how a grassroots group in Kansas met some transportation needs before we even knew what a SIL was. Luann, would you like to take it?
Sure. So some of this, Paula and I were talking about the years that this all occurred. But so in 1978, I had just returned home. Actually, prior to that, 10 months after I acquired my disability, I left for college at Emporia State University and got involved for the first time. This was my first introduction into disability rights and activism, and got involved in the Handicapped Student Association there at the university. Became the secretary of the organization under Dwayne French as the president, for those old timers that knew Dwayne through the years. Upon returning from college that end of that year back home to Hays, Kansas, I got involved with it was a newly formed group called the Western Kansas Association on Concerns of the Disabled that had just been started working on some local issues not long before I came back. And one of the things that we began working on quickly was the lack of accessible transportation in our community. I mean, it wasn't that there wasn't accessible transportation, it was that there was no public transportation. So if you did not own your own vehicle or have a family member or friend to transport you, then you didn't go anywhere. And so we really felt we needed to get some accessible public transportation going in the community, so people were able to not only access medical appointments and shopping for their needs or that, but to be able to go to a movie or to a restaurant and such. Of course, there were a lot of access barriers back then, but things were starting to improve. We were working on some of that too. So, but what happened was we developed some communication with the Easter Seals organization in Wichita, and they gave us this old full-size van with a manual ramp on the side, which was great. We were so excited. Okay, here we have accessible transportation. But then the dilemma was we needed drivers. So we worked with the local university. The Dean of Student Affairs there was very supportive of our group and the changes that we wanted to see made. And so he arranged for us to be able to use some of their work study students as drivers. And one of our members then, Skeeter, ran the dispatch from his home. And this became access transportation in Hays, Kansas. And the system ran this way for a number of years, and then it started to grow so much, and there was so much potential for it to even grow further, that we worked with the IDD organization, and they kind of took over the administration of that, just because they had the ability to do that, and the staff, which they still operate. And now I mean, the transportation system's larger than ever and still doesn't meet all the needs in the community. And it's also been presented at national conferences numerous times through the years. So, but through that involvement of that organization, and I think Paula might talk about that a little bit more too, is how I became involved with LINK, living independently in Northwest Kansas, which is the one of the first 10 Title VII centers in the country. So here in rural Kansas. So I will pass that on to, I'm not sure who's going next. I think Daryl.
Daryl's next. So Daryl, if you'd come on and tell us about New York.
Hello, everybody. Thank you. I first want to thank the Lynchburg Area Center for Independent Living for letting me use their offices and internet. I work at home, but my internet is usually pretty unstable. So the center that is closest to me is in Lynchburg, Virginia. So I am talking to you from their offices today. I would like to take everyone back to the year 1976. That year, Gerald Ford was president of the United States. The Pittsburgh Steelers defeated the Dallas Cowboys in the Super Bowl in Miami. Clifford Alexander Jr. was confirmed as the first African-American Secretary of the United States Army. The Apple Computer Company was formed by Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak in California. And also that year, I left the vocational rehabilitation profession to become director of a nursing home transition project for young adults with significant disabilities at the County Chronic Care Institution in Monroe County, New York. It was that position that introduced me to the world of independent living and disability rights. When I was a young VR counselor, I was pretty naive about much about how the world worked. I was given an extended probation by my supervisor because he said I gave my clients too much involvement in their VR plan. I was told that I needed to be more directive because I was the professional and I was spending tax dollars, which we couldn't waste on trial and error, as people were trying to figure out who they were. I was told that it was required that I would tell people who they were and what was best for them based on the testing and evaluation measures. I left the medical model rehab world because it wasn't a good match for me, not because I had yet developed a clear philosophy about disability rights. I was still trying to figure out what rights and equity meant to me as a woman. And women's liberation was a very hot topic in those days. I just knew that there was something disturbing about not allowing people to be who they wanted to be. And I knew that the nursing home transition project was calling to me when I heard about it. During that project, I learned about Centers for Independent Living. My project didn't have the funds to send me to Berkeley, but I interviewed some of that SILS staff by phone to learn what they were doing. I also interviewed someone at the Atlantis community in Denver, which is another early center that has a very high profile. And then I did visit the Boston Center for Independent Living, which I have never shared with Bill Henning. But in 1976, I went to the dorm where disabled students lived who needed a certain level of accessibility and shared personal assistance services so that they could attend school. I also visited the Brooklyn Center for Independent Living, which had grown out of the Muscular Dystrophy League. I'm not sure I have that name correct, but it was a society for people with muscular dystrophy. That center was focused on working with consumers with MD at that time who wanted to live in their own apartments. And when I saw the modifications the center had made to the apartments and the 24-hour consumer-directed personal assistance services they had negotiated with the New York State Health Department, I was blown away. And my life was never to be the same again because it gave me a vision of how the people I was working with at Monroe Community Hospital could actually successfully transition to and live in the community. I was immunocompromised, which I have been since birth. But in those days, I had not identified as a person with a disability. So I had not been aware that right there in Rochester, New York, was one of the most active and powerful grassroots disability rights groups in the country. They reached out to me when they learned about the nursing home transition project and gave me an award at their annual dinner for doing my job. Then they invited me to be on their board, which in those days acted as their staff for what work they were doing in the community since they had little funding. At that point in time, they had been in business for about 15 years already. Remember, we're talking about 1976. They had been meeting with the mayor and the city council and county officials to bring about systems change. They had been doing public education. They were working on developing a guidebook to accessible businesses and public accommodations in the county. Names that you have probably never heard, people like Joe Perella Jr. and Patricia Laird, were my teachers. My education and indoctrination about consumer control, empowerment, and systems change took off like a rocket because I could see it in action. Then, when the Rehabilitation Act was amended in 1978 to create the Independent Living Program, it was a no-brainer that we were a natural organization to apply for funding to start a SIL. And we were approached by the state VR agency to do just that. And now New York State has the largest number of centers of any state in the nation because we were successful in getting state legislation passed. One of my favorite quotes, if you would advance to slide 8, please, is one by a former professor of communication studies, an associate director of the Center for Urban Affairs at Northwestern University, John McKnight. You may have heard that name. Back in 1979, before it was popular to say such things, he said at a professional seminar, revolutions begin when people who are defined as problems achieve the power to redefine the problem. To me, the most noteworthy thing about the SIL that we created in Rochester, and that center has accomplished a great deal in these 40 plus years. But the most noteworthy thing to me was that they were a grassroots organization that had already been in existence for so many years and automatically understood about consumer control. They didn't have to develop that knowledge or that skill. They call themselves Handicapped Independence Here, HERE, which stood for through housing, education, recreation, and employment. In so many ways, they were already a SIL. They just didn't have any staff or individual consumers. And I have often thought, if there were any researchers in the audience, I have often thought it would make a very interesting study to look at whether there are differences in the way SILs develop and how successful they are if they grew out of an existing grassroots group that had already established a sense of disability pride within a community, versus if the SIL was created simply by a nonprofit organization getting a federal grant. By 1979, the year that we actually started that center, there were way more grassroots activities taking place across the US than I think most people in IL realize. Most of you have heard the history of Ed Roberts and Judy Heumann because much has been written and said about them and the Berkeley Center, the sit-ins in San Francisco, and the blocking of traffic in Manhattan. But not much has been recorded or shared outside of the individual states about the literally hundreds of other people in many cities that had been laying groundwork for a couple of decades at that point. And that groundwork ultimately led to the 1978 amendments to the Rehab Act. So many people will have never been properly acknowledged because of their leadership, because the disability rights movement was in its infancy at the time. I wanted this opportunity to share some of my history during this institute because there aren't many people from my generation of IL pioneers left. And certainly most of the people who preceded me in the earlier generations are now dead. And I think it's especially unfortunate because of the time that we are in, that the people of color who were founding members of the movement are pretty much gone now and are not here to be part of the vital conversations we're having about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Before the rest of us disappear, I am glad for the chance to encourage all of you to interview the IL pioneers in your state and begin writing down those early stories, because those legacies can be so empowering to the young leaders who are emerging. My involvement in independent living for the past 40 plus years is one example of how IL has reinvented itself and continues to evolve. And we have way more resources today than we did back then. We need to remember that. Many people with disabilities, such as mine, people with hidden disabilities, for example, are now on the staffs and boards of centers and are consumers of SIL advocacy and services. And all of us are continuously learning what true disability justice means. I want to go back to John McKnight's quote for a moment. I use this quote because I think he said something important for it being the year 1979. He referred to the civil rights movement when he was trying to explain what he meant by his quote. He said that he believed that the civil rights movement was able to start getting traction when Black people were able to declare that it was not they who were deficient. It was the attitudes and barriers of society that needed to be changed. And this revolutionary idea was adopted by other groups. He didn't name the independent living movement, probably because it was too early for him to even know about it. But he talked about people who were viewed as clients and perpetual patients. Basically, a class of people who were considered deficient and in need of the help of professionals to be considered adequate. The self-help movement in general grew out of this recognition, as Bonnie O'Day talked about earlier. The problem was redefined. People with disabilities started saying, I am not deficient. The problem is deficiencies in the community. And I would just like to say that sometimes, ironically, still run the risk of slipping back into the professional problem, as John McKnight called it. If we're not ever vigilant about who's in control of one's life and who the leaders of the IL movement are. So I'm going to stop there and turn it back to Paula or Luann, if either one of you wanted to add to what's already been said.
Well, just a little bit, and I don't know if Luann wants to jump in here too, but so much of what we see today when centers are struggling to understand and respond to the community, the disability community, sometimes what we see is that very thing that Daryl mentioned, which is that the staff move themselves again into a role of the professional with the assumption that they know better than the individual. And sometimes I think this comes because we have a lot of people who aren't coming to centers anymore. They go through the school system and into employment and into life, and they don't come see us at the centers. I wish they would, because they would make our community much stronger. And I think finding ways to involve those folks that have never been involved in the center but have disabilities is a challenge for board recruitment and staff recruitment both. But I think that as we look at that situation, a lot of times the people who are coming in our door have a greater level of need than some of the earlier folks. And then the assumption is, well, then we know better, because they wouldn't be in this situation if they didn't whatever it is, have a history of addiction, if they weren't homeless, if they didn't have, other situations going on in their lives that impact them in addition to their disability, some coexisting situation. A lot of the folks we see these days are folks with a very high level of need for getting back into equal access in the community. They are a long way from that in their current situation. That doesn't give us permission to become the professional. And I think that never forgetting that activism came first, rules and regs and core services and so forth came later. Consumer control was a principle that was in place for the purpose of some very interesting change, including those, ramps poured at night that Richard mentioned. Lots of active work to make change happen so that the community was accessible and that we all had equal access to the community. That is the thing we want to communicate most, right? That is the thing that we hope most will have an impact on you as you look at your center services and as you think about what you can do to have true community, true consumer control. Consumer control at every level, consumer control in every activity, consumer control as you make decisions about your planning and where you go and what you're going to do. All of that is so important. And we want to make sure that that's in place at your center. We want to include in this institute a real focus on how we can make sure that that happens. I don't know if we have some other comments, if Luann wanted to make some other comments, but I think we can go on to the next slide, Jenny.
I'm good, Paula. I think you guys got it covered.
Okay. Well, I gave you this, I got myself mixed up and gave you this information on that other slide, but there was one other point on that other slide that we want to mention, and that is that this happened not just at the local level, but also at the national level. So when you saw the development of those first 10 states that were funded under the Rehab Act to have centers granted in early, in the beginning of the October 1979 and continuing through that from there, as you see that happen, the other thing that you see happen almost immediately is discussion about how to have a national impact. And so almost immediately there was conversation about what became Nickel. How can we have a national council? We like to make words out of everything. Did you notice that, Link and Nickel and April, which came a few years later. But Nickel, as the National Council on Independent Living, rolled out of those early meetings with the grantees, with those 11 grantees, actually 10 states. And Daryl and I, because we were the walkies in the group and did not at the time consider ourselves to have a disability because everybody else had such a, clear disability and we didn't. Ours were invisible and we weren't even really sure at the time if they counted. We were relegated as the secretaries. So we took all the notes and typed them up. I wish that we had computers at the time. I know, can you guys even imagine that we didn't have computers? There were a few computers, but they weren't very useful. They were located within mainframes, and personal computers were just beginning, as Daryl noted that Apple was just starting. And so we took handwritten notes and we went to a typewriter and we typed them up. And we both wish that we had kept the handwritten notes and the, made carbon copies that we could take home, because that would have been a really interesting historical conversation around Nickel, which came out of those early things. So Max Starkloff and Mark Abristo were among those first 10 center directors, and they were also the first directors of nickel as time rolled out. And then a little later, not a lot later, but a little later in the early 80s, the rural centers began to say nickel doesn't meet our needs entirely because they're so focused on urban things. So when you talk about urban transportation, it's very different than rural transportation, for example. And so the Association of Programs for Rural Independent Living also came about shortly. But part of what we wanted to make sure happened was that whatever was going on in independent living, that we were sharing that with each other, that somehow we were communicating with one another, all the best practices, all the good ideas, all the fun things that we were running across, the ways that the counties were interacting with us, the way the state was interacting, so that we could have the best possible result from that. So that was a part of what we had in mind at the time. And I don't know, Daryl, if you want to add to that from your memories of the note taking and the typewriting.
Well, I do remember it. I remember us going off into a separate room from the rest of the group to actually do some of our work. And what I remember most about those experiences was the sense of empowerment that I gained by being with my peers. Because as a new center director in a totally new program that hadn't yet figured out what it was supposed to be doing, I mean, we understood the consumer control aspect, but in terms of day-to-day operations, what we were actually supposed to be doing was actually kind of terrifying to me. And we didn't yet have the level of guidance from the federal government that we have today. So we were just making up stuff as we went along. So for me, the sense of empowerment and collective voice and power that coming together as a group of centers was something I will never, ever forget, because it was transformative. And I kept saying over and over how that peer relationship opportunity was beginning to transform the world. It was beginning to transform me personally.
Yes.
So it was clear how it was operating in the larger world. So that, thank you for sharing those memories, Paula.
Yeah, the powerful nature of the group itself. And I don't know whose idea it was when the grants were first developed, but somebody decided instead of having 11 grants, we'll save one grant's worth to make it possible for these grantees to meet together. And that was why we were able to do that. And that was a really great one. If you all have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A block. We prefer that to the chat, but if you drop them in the chat, we'll try and catch them as well. So feel free to do that. Dee Dee said, Paula, we kept the notes on the formation of our center. And I was a little bit involved in that. So I'm glad to hear it. Yeah, we need to respect our history. The other thing that just to promote ILRU a little bit, ILRU was also already in existence prior to these grants. People don't always realize that, but Lex Frieden, who is our leader still, was very involved with the development of ILRU in the early 1976 was the starting date, and provided some training to those first centers right out of the gate. Came out to see us in Western Kansas, and I took a picture of him out in the middle of the Main Street, Stockton at 6 o'clock when the only cars were down at the bar and nothing in the business area. Because,
Paula, I remember when they came up
right
to do that. And I recall Lex, his hand controls went out on his car when they were a ways out from getting here, and he ended up, he used a stick or something to actually drive the rest of the way to get into town. I don't know why, that's always stuck in my mind.
Well, yeah, and then to get those repaired after he got here. So
Yeah.
yeah. You know, I think it was in here somewhere. Charlie Carr mentioned some of those early BIPOC leaders that Jody is asking about. And I think probably that's in some of the questions up above. So there are some, Shannon asked about self-reports of the people in the disability rights movement, and there are some YouTube videos, quite a few of them, from some of the early folks, so you might be able to take a look at that. I've wondered sometimes, I'm an NPR fan, and I've wondered sometimes if StoryCorps might be an option, you know, to do some StoryCorps interviews. I think that would be really interesting for us to do at some point. But yeah, to capture that history, because I think we learn from it. I guess that's where I come from. If I go back to my roots, I'm better at remembering what we do and why. And so I know for some of you, this seems like old history, but hopefully it's useful for you to begin to think about what consumer control really means. And it means something more than those numbers. Yeah. Any other questions? We've got 5 minutes before we need to drop off. So Kay asks, how do you embrace consumer control in IL in a positive way? This was actually from the last call, but I thought it was important. So anybody want to jump in on that one? I think that my response would be you embrace it by really realizing who's in control, and making it more than numbers. Because if you have a few shy people on your board who don't speak out, the fact that they have a disability doesn't always make it consumer control if they're dominated by people without a disability in that discussion. So, you know, Charlie said that Lex did simulated CIL trainings early in Houston. Yeah, it was in 81, Charlie. I was there. The simulations were from Cornell. And they were how to be an executive director, and they simulated all kinds of events and emergencies, and then how you handled that gave you the outcome at the end of the simulation, but it was pretty fun. Do the panelists feel that the movement is still currently aligned with the critical or original spirit and intent of the law, or has there been a shift in strategy and priorities that guide our work? Ooh, what a good question. Daryl, you want to speak to that?
Well, that's a very hard question to answer, because we, you know, from the national level, we see bits and pieces of things. We don't have a comprehensive profile of what's going on in the independent living movement. And that's something that I wish we could get funded to do, so that we could really do some tracking of what centers are accomplishing over time, to show the growth, the evolution, and have something concrete to be able to answer that question. Because I honestly don't know.
Yeah, anecdotally, I would say that I see some centers that are drifting. You know, and I can say that sometimes that drift has to do with I don't want to misstate this, but that professionalism, and I don't want to say that staff should be unprofessional, but that assuming a professional stance that causes the consumer to feel less in control is one way that I see that drift. Another way that I see that drift is chasing after money. And some of the, some of the ways in which centers have approached employment contracts, for example, and other contracts, I see a little drift there sometimes. And we're out of time because I see Jenny.
Yeah,
Probably about 30 seconds. Go ahead, Daryl.
Could I just add, I see the same drifting that Paula's talking about. By the same token, I think she and I both also see some very powerful, effective work being done all across the country that's very consistent with the original spirit and intent of the program. So, it's some of this and it's some of that. We just don't have a comprehensive profile at this point in our development. So if there is any funder on this call who would like to fund a really fabulous project, there's one I'd like to suggest.
Yeah.
I'm going to go with that's a great way to end this session. And I want to let everybody on the call know, come back again. You should have a new link for this afternoon session. These lovely ladies are going to be finishing off their session this afternoon at 3 p.m. Eastern time. And then we'll also go into the future of IL diversity. And so I'm excited to hear what everybody has to say. Thank you for joining us, and see you all in 2 hours.